is French as well. Unlike all the Baptists and Pentecostals I grew up with, he was raised Catholic. And most significant, he carried with him a kind of Southern respectability that, from my point of view, was very distinctive. My father was a first-generation migrant, while my mother was second-generation, and this difference was crucial. He was rooted, and she was flighty, never staying in one place for too long. Forgetfulness even of her family's past was not necessarily a bad thing for my mother, but for my dad, the past was everything. My father frequently travels to a home in North Carolina that's been in his family for over 60 years. When he speaks of Fayetteville, he tips his nose to the sky and grins. Although my father has been in the North since the early 80s, he knows there is nothing like that soil down there. And that attachment to the land is something Black Northerners, including my mother, just do not have. There's been a certain air about him for as long as I can remember. Whenever he walked into a room, he projected authority. And whenever I visited my father's home, my mother would devote painstaking effort to making sure that I looked the part. I had to wear jewelry as a sign of sophistication, my clothes had to be ironed, and my posture had to be straight. I had to show that I was just as well adjusted as my 3 sisters, whom I envied tremendously. They visited my father's family more often than I did, and they'd met my paternal grandfather and had more memories of my paternal grandmother than I will ever have. When I first visited my father's family in the South, people would incorrectly guess whose daughter I was, or they'd plainly state that they didn't know who I was. My father's family was always still mindful of the South, whereas my mother's family seemed to have always been in southern New Jersey. Only recently have I learned where my maternal grandparents were born. They once lived in Atlantic City and eventually moved to a quieter and wider suburb in Atlantic County to give my mother and her 3 siblings a better life. But no home has been in our family name for longer than 23 years. My mother moved more than 10 times in the earlier part of her life. These vicissitudes might signal an erratic nature to an outside observer, but my family was simply conditioned to believe that movement meant advancement. Every home had to be better than the last. Being too grounded might lead to stagnation. We weren't rooted like my father's family. The Regis's oral histories were abundant, whereas those of the Jerkinses were vaguer and incomplete. Much of my conversation with my mother's side of the family is characterized by whispers and silences. My maternal grandfather would place a fake mouse outside the door of his children's bedroom whenever grown folks were about to talk, so that my mother and aunt would not eavesdrop. My mother was never that severe in her approach, but I knew that I might be scolded if I stepped outside of my bedroom when adults were conversing. This was one way in which knowledge of who I am and where I came from was kept from me. Even when I was given the space to speak with an adult, like my mother, the conversations were full of dead ends. As a child, if I ever inquired about why we sang a particular song at a family dinner or why we held certain superstitions, I was never satisfied with the answer. That's just what we do, or that's just what Black people do, was never good enough for me. As an adult, I realized that my family simply didn't know how to draw connections with how they think, act, and navigate their lives in a way that forges a community of relatives. They might have been satisfied in the unknown, but I wasn't. No one spoke about the past. The goal was to move forward and never look back. Neither my mother nor I has taken a trip to the South to visit family. We don't talk about the soil like my father and his people. We can talk about the make and model of cars with more accuracy than about the flora and fauna of our homeland. While my father prides himself on origins, my mother prides herself on originality. She believes that you can create your own identity as long as you keep moving. I moved to New York in 2015 as a way to not get stuck, forging an identity as an author and editor in the hub of the publishing world. When people would ask me where I was from, my throat would dry up. New Jersey, I'd reply. If pressed, I'd specify Southern New Jersey. And if their curiosity hadn't cooled by then,